Hello and welcome to another edition of Tuesdays with the Disability Policy for All. Today we're going to be talking about a new subject that we haven't ever talked about, which is housing. But housing is so very important, so I thought that we should talk about it with a friend. And so welcome Dianne. And Dianne Dressler is a senior associate with Community Life Resource. So again, welcome Dianne.
Thanks, Liz. I'm happy to be here.
The first question is, what does HUD stand for, and what does HUD do in general?
Oh, thanks for the question, Liz. First, let me tell you just a little bit about myself, because while I don't work for HUD, and I haven't worked for HUD, I have done a lot of work at the state and local and national level on housing programs that HUD administers. So I can tell you a little bit about what I know about HUD. HUD is a federal department of the U.S. government, and HUD stands for Housing and Urban Development. HUD is a department that implements policies and programs to address America's housing needs. So some of those housing needs are for affordable housing for low-income people. Some of those housing needs are for community development. So HUD also sets those policies and makes the rules for those programs. So it helps the local government that is the one that actually implements the programs. It helps them understand what the rules are and what they need to do to make sure that those programs are fair for everybody who's eligible for them.
Okay, thank you. The next question is, how does HUD help people with disability to find and stay in their homes? And are there tools or resources available?
Well, HUD in general doesn't help specific individuals to find housing or to stay in their homes. But they do provide programs and funding for state and counties and cities and towns to help people with disabilities find housing and stay in their homes. So some of those programs are things that you might have heard of. One of them is called the Housing Choice Voucher Program. It's also known as Section 8 formerly. And that is what we call a rent subsidy program that helps people pay rent in an apartment or a home that they are leasing. That program is operated typically through a public housing authority, which is a local organization in a city or a county maybe that gets the funding to implement that program for HUD. The rules are provided by HUD, as I said before, but each housing authority implements those rules a little bit differently. So some housing authorities have the Housing Choice Voucher Program, and that's a program where people they get a voucher and they can go searching for housing that meets their needs. And the housing authority will help people find that housing if they need help to find a place to rent. Some housing authorities have what we call public housing, and that is a building or a set of buildings that the housing authority owns, and the rent in those apartments in that building is affordable to people with low income. And HUD provides the money to the housing authority to make sure that that's affordable. So some housing authorities have both the voucher program and public housing. Some have one or the other. Some housing authorities develop their own housing using other private resources or state or county resources. And some housing authorities might use local, maybe county money to operate a totally separate rent subsidy program that's different from everybody else. So I always tell people that if they've seen one housing authority, they've seen one housing authority, and that they should find those resources in their local area. The HUD website does have resources. They have some publications that will help people understand the programs that they have. They also have a list of all of the housing authorities in the country. There are hundreds of housing authorities in the country. And they have a list of all of them, and that can help people know who to contact in their local area.
So when you're talking about building, are you talking about an institution or just like an apartment building?
I'm talking about an apartment complex, yes.
Like the apartment that I live in.
That's right. Apartment that you live in, apartments that I've lived in. HUD also has home ownership programs, so that, again, are administered at the state or local level, but they help people get housing counseling to help them understand the home buying process, and can also help with down payment or paying for a home.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
What are some of the important things for people with disability and they have family and their family members to know when they're looking for a place to live?
That's a really good question too, Liz. Just like everybody, people need to think about where they want to live and how their home needs to help them live in their community. So people certainly need to think about transportation. So if you have a car, you might be able to get lots of places rather easily. But some people who don't have a car need to think about being close to public transportation. So they can use a bus or the metro or subway or some other form of transportation to get where they need to go. Often people with disabilities need to use public transportation, so they think about living close to shopping, so they might be able to walk or not have to travel too far to get there. They might want to live close to where they work, so that they can either walk to work or take a short bus ride to work. They might think about living close to family or friends or to their place of worship. So those are all important things for people to think through. Sometimes people with disabilities might need something different in their home because they need physically accessible housing. So sometimes if a person uses a wheelchair or might have some other challenges with using steps, some mobility challenges, they might want to have an apartment that doesn't have any steps up to the entrance. Maybe it has a ramp, or maybe it just has a flat entry. Sometimes inside the apartment, people with disabilities need to think about the floor covering. So is it easy to roll the wheelchair over the floor? Does it have carpet that makes it harder to use? Is the kitchen easy to use? Can they reach the appliances? Is the bathroom accessible? Can they turn the wheelchair in the bathroom, get in and out of the tub, those kinds of things. So those are important to think through. And I think probably one of the most important things is to make sure that the place they're living is safe, and that the neighborhood's safe, that there's good lighting, and they feel like they can, be comfortable in the neighborhood where they're living.
Okay, thanks. The last question is, what else should our viewers know about housing policy?
Well, a couple of things to understand about some of HUD's housing policies are that many of their programs are designed for people with low income, but they do have some special programs for people with disabilities. There are some of those housing choice vouchers that are set aside especially for people with disabilities. Not all of the housing authorities have those vouchers, but some do. So checking with the local housing authority is a good way to find out if a person's area has that voucher. In addition, HUD has a new program called HUD 811 Project Rental Assistance. It's a fairly new program. It's available in 32 states and the District of Columbia. And it is a rent subsidy program just for people with disabilities. People can rent in an apartment that has been made affordable with some other programs that HUD has to develop affordable housing. And people can live there and have a rent subsidy while they're living in one of those units. Each of those states with the HUD 811 program has a little bit different eligibility criteria. So again, it's important to check with the local government, the state government in that case, the state housing agency, about their HUD 811 program. I think a couple of other things to keep in mind are that the need for affordable housing is much greater than the availability of resources. So there's just not enough money from Congress to pay for all of the housing resources that are needed. And there are often long wait lists. Sometimes the waiting list for a housing resource might even be closed because the wait list has been so long. So the availability of a rent subsidy or a housing program might not happen very quickly. Sometimes it can take months or even years before somebody can access that resource.
Okay, thanks. There's two more things I wanted to ask you. One is all those programs that you just talked about, they're not segregated? Are they just for people with disability, or my father could live in those apartments?
The programs I've talked with you about are all what we call integrated in community.
Okay.
So that means that people with disabilities are living in the community with neighbors who are not a person with a disability. So they might have a neighbor who has a disability, they might have a neighbor who does not have a disability. The HUD 811 program has a requirement that no more than 25% of the apartments in a particular project, no more than 25% are for people with disabilities. So they want to make sure that people with disabilities have the opportunity to live in inclusive communities alongside, anybody else who might live in that community.
Thanks. And earlier when we were talking, you were saying that you had a connection to AUCD.
Yes, I do. Thanks for bringing that up, Liz. I used to work for one of the university centers for excellence in developmental disabilities, and before I went to work for Community Life Resources. And when I was with that organization, I represented AUCD on the Consortium for Citizens with Disabilities Housing Task Force. So after I left that, you said I continued to represent AUCD as a volunteer on that housing task force, and I continue to do so today.
Okay, great. What else should our viewers know about housing policy?
Well, I think another important policy area is fair housing. So the United States has a number of laws that provide special accommodations for people with disabilities, and they also have the fair housing law that prevents discrimination against people with disabilities in housing. So, for example, in general, landlords cannot refuse to rent to a person with a disability because they have a disability. There are some exceptions to this for really small landlords or somebody renting space in their own home, but by and large, a landlord cannot say to a person with a disability that they don't want to rent to them because they think their medical needs are too great and they wouldn't be successful, as an example. Some of the other important policies are what we call reasonable accommodations, which allow a person with a disability to ask for a change in a role or a policy of a housing provider that will enable the person with a disability to use that housing just like somebody who doesn't have a disability. So for example, a housing authority can provide an additional bedroom for somebody to have a living caregiver. that can assist that person with their activities of daily living in their home at no extra cost to the person with the disability.
Okay, thank you. And if you have any questions about this or any other policy issues, please go to the AUCG webpage and look for this week's in brief. And if you have any questions or comments about this week's Tuesdays with Liz, please leave them in the space below. Thanks again, Diane.
Thanks, Liz. Nice to
Aye.
see you.